Hello, let me check in with the first two chapters of Superior, The Return of the Race Science by Angela Sani, a British award-winning science journalist. And her look at how, sort of post-World War II, post-Nazis, we abandoned for a good hunk of time, in the West, the idea of, there being any scientific basis for race differentiation and, kind of post-colonial. Not that this has particularly been a perfect thing, but it had, and definitely we still have the deep tendrils of it in our science, in our thought, in our culture, in our institutions. But it looked like, maybe it's ebbing. But with the publication of the 1994 The Bell Curve, we've slowly started to see it reassert itself yet again, with all the kind of opening up of actually allowing voices of the others, i.e. non-white, non-Western, all that, actually allowing those voices into the conversation. Actually not allowing, but, trying to dismantle all the stuff that actively kept them out and othered them and shut them down and quiet them. Yes, race science is coming back. So she starts off with, let's go to the origins and literal origins of, the first chapter about, the origins of the human race. It's like, where does it come from? And the idea of regionalist thought of that, where there were various different regions where human beings came from versus kind of the classical one, which is, a specific valley in the continent of Africa was the cradle of the human race. And, how this idea of the kind of a regional thing has been used by some, not necessarily people who originally originated it, as sort of a basis for racist stuff of like, oh look, yes, white people come from a different stock than other ones. But, and there being more nuanced views that there is actually probably a variety of different sources within the continent of Africa, where human beings, characteristics of what would become human beings maybe originated from. Let me pause for a second. But yes, there also being, that more of a kind of nuanced, complex look at where it came from. And, just the idea that we might actually want to try and give up this idea of an origin of the species, that, human beings have always becoming and will continue to become human beings. And there being drop-outs, drop-ins into all this whole thought of, what is a human being? What is that? Is something that's can be a little bit more complicated. There is definitely strong points here of like, a lot of the science, the archaeology of this has its basis in European, science, which, guess what, uses the European ideals and what we're going to consider as human, as that is what's going to get used as the measuring posts for this. There's a lot of this measuring posts where you have to be very careful, because it turns out the person measuring often is using themselves as the actual ultimate measuring rod. So stuff like that, we do a lot of stuff with cave paintings discovered in France. I believe it's France. But, that is saying like, that is the birth of human consciousness. But it's like, well, are we doing that because that's what we discovered in Europe? And so we're using that as the benchmark versus who knows what much earlier examples of human beings who are physically indistinguishable, as far as we can tell from archaeological records, with human beings in Europe. Are they that much different? And there's also very much a thing here about Australians, the indigenous people of Australia, and how they were considered Neanderthals initially because of the thing, and because at the beginning they considered Neanderthals as being brutish and savage and all that. And then when it switched, where Neanderthals were like, oh, actually they might have been quite gentle and intelligent beings, that then suddenly they got adopted as European in nature. So it's interesting how shifting perspectives will reject or take on something as quite proudly as something of that, which was interesting. Second chapter is much more about the science of race, and really what we think of about race nowadays only became a thing in the 19th century, coincidentally with colonialism, where we're looking for scientific justification for the subjugation, exploitation, conquering of various peoples throughout the world, and using our signposts to decide that they are less than human, and thus it was perfectly okay for us to do the horrible, and I mean us in the sense of I'm of British stock. It was perfectly justified for us to enslave and exploit thus these people, other peoples, because they looked different. It wasn't just look different, it was that they were less than human. There's also an extra kind of really illuminating thing here of saying, even people like Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Charles Darwin, all thought, yes, abolition is a really good thing, but very much balked at the idea that people of darker skins were actually going to be the equal of human beings. It was always like, they should be free. Slavery is a bad thing, but it didn't prevent there still to be, thing of no, they can't be as logical. They can't be as, artistic. They can't be as scientific as white people can. And Darwin was very much for abolition and all that, which is really great. But some of the racist assumptions of kind of evolutionary scale of human beings was taken up by his more virulently racist supporters. Huxley comes in here, Darwin's bulldog, who were very much, people, these are lesser people and all that. So I mean, the author is, as far as I'm concerned, very rightly coming from a point of view of these whole things of there is no genetic difference between me and a black person and a Chinese person, or a Indian person, which I believe is what her heritage is originally. Then it's nothing there that actually makes a difference of different abilities, or the range. We're all in the same goddamn range. We're all human beings. There's secondary characteristics that don't have fucking anything to do with our ability, or things of freedom or reasoning, or any of these things, or of what gets considered civilized and all that. So it's popular. It's definitely popular science, fairly clearly done. It's interesting to just hear the kind of the deep history of a lot of this stuff, where he's definitely examining a Western phenomenon of race science, this pseudoscience, and how that pseudoscience is definitely coming back in quarters, if it ever went away in the first place. All right, I will leave it there for the moment. more videos later.